I'm using a I don't know what it's called. Oh, I can't get it right. Hey up everyone, Emma the Tiny Turner here. Welcome to my YouTube channel. I have got a fun, festive little project for us today. I'm going to be making one of these freestanding snowman decorations which lights up with fairy lights in it. Fantastic little project, and the brilliant thing is because they are battery powered, they are extremely versatile as to where you can put them. So I'm going to get all the bits and pieces together that I need to make one, and we can get cracking. For this project you will need a piece of timber for the base, which is roughly between 4.5 and 6 inches in diameter, and it needs to be 2 inches thick so that there's plenty of room to put a recess on there for the battery case. The snowman's head is going to be turned from a piece of sycamore. This is 2 inches square. Lengthwise, it doesn't matter too much, as long as you've got about 3 inches or so lengthwise, you just need enough room to put a spigot on there for holding it into the chuck. This is 6 inches and I'll probably get about 3 snowman heads out of this. I am also going to use a piece of ash. This is going to be used for our snowman's hat. Now, I turned these separately and I'm going to take through how to embellish this with some ebonising lacquer and some gilt cream. It's just something different that you can do to add a little bit of an extra dimension to the snowman. And ash is a fantastic timber for embellishing because it's got this nice open grain. If you do not want to do that step, that's fine. You can turn the hat out of any timber that you'd really like. The ash again is 2 inches square, and again this is 6 inches long, but I will probably only get 2 hats out of this piece of timber because I like to make them quite large. You will also need one of the large DIY Snowmen kits that I sell through my website. I will put a link in the description below. The kit consists of an 8cm hand-blown iridescent glass globe, which will form the body of the snowman, some hook and loop tape, which is for affixing the battery case to the underside of the base, as you will see, and last but not least, we've got a 2-metre length of 20 LEDs. So this is your string of fairy lights, and there are lots of different colour options for you to choose from. So that is your snowman kit. That is all the elements that you need apart from the adhesive, but we'll go through that in a little while. I tend to start these projects with turning the base, so I've got a piece of Zebrano here that I'm going to put between centres, and I'm using steb centres, which I prefer and do a lot of different projects really. Most of my projects start life between steb centres. I'm going to begin turning this with a 1/4 inch ball gouge, so you've got a much smaller cutting surface area in contact with the timber. Keeping the speed to begin with about 1000 RPM, because it is between centres, so we just want to make sure that the wood behaves properly. Just turn the speed up a little bit now, so about 2000 RPM. We need to move the tool rest in slightly, and then I'm going to change the cut that I'm doing with the chisel. Instead of turning at 90 degrees, I'm going to twist the chisel so that the angle of the tool is approximately 45 degrees from the piece of timber. So there's going to be a lot of bevel rubbing now, and we're going to maintain that 45-degree angle across the face of this piece of timber, which means it's going to allow us to achieve a much better tool finish. We'll keep the speed nice and high, and the key now is to move the chisel very slowly across the timber. You're allowing the chisel to cut instead of forcing it. And what you might be able to see is that because there's so much bevel rubbing, it actually starts to burnish the wood, makes it shiny. And the sort of shavings that you'll get if you're doing this correctly are these very, very wiry ribbons of shavings. Now obviously this isn't the final shape, but if you deal with tear out as it happens, it's not going to end up creating a compounded problem. So we'll do one more cut, and then we can put our spigot on and get this into the chuck and start shaping the rest of the base. Okay, so that's given us a very good base. It's nearly got rid of all the tear out on this piece of timber. So we can now move on. We need to put a spigot on whichever end of whichever face we wish to be the top. So I'm going to put my spigot on here, and I'm going to use a beading parting tool. I've lifted the tool rest slightly, which means it makes me lay the chisel onto the piece of wood so that the bevel is rubbing. I'm going to begin cutting it with just a third of the tool. Going in there with the full width of the chisel, or even just slightly less, is putting a lot of strain on both the chisel and the wood. It's asking it to cut a lot. So if you find that it's fighting, then halve your cut, or even more so. And now we've established our spigot, we need to dovetail that slightly so that it will fit correctly in the jaws. It's important not to over dovetail your spigots, because if you do that, they won't fit correctly in the jaws if you over chamfer it, and the jaws will only hold the chucking point on the outermost area, so on the widest diameter, which is at this edge, and it can mean that things can rock slightly. We can now take this out and put this into the jaws of the chuck and start to turn the base. Next job is to turn the underside. So this is now the base, and the top that we've just turned the spigot on has been put into the jaws of the chuck. We need to make sure that we try and chamfer this ever so slightly so that it will sit on this outside edge, and that just means if the wood warps a little bit, it's going to reduce the possibility of it rocking. So by chamfering it slightly or making it a little bit concave, it just helps reduce that possibility. We then need to put the recess in here, which will hold the battery case, and it will enable us to turn this round and hold it on expansion. So those are the two jobs we have to do now. So we'll begin by facing this off with the 1/4" bow gouge. We're still about 2,500 RPM. Now we face this off, next job is to put the recess on here. The recess ideally needs to be about 2.5 to 3 inches in diameter, which will give you plenty of room to fit the battery case. I tend to go for 2.5 inches because it means I can put it onto these jaws on expansion, whereas at 3 inches I might need to change jaws. So for me that's fine, but anywhere between those two measurements is absolutely fine. So I'll get my tape measure out. Got the centre point still on here, which I'll just highlight slightly with the pencil. So we've still got our centre pot mark here, and if the overall diameter is 2.5 inches, then we need to be marking out to 1.25 inches, which is half that. And if we put our pencil on the tool rest and just spin that, that will give us our 2.5 inches recess. Take our straight edge parting chisel now, and we can use that line as our guideline to go straight in. And I'm taking half a tool width relief cut next to it. Depth wise, you want to be aiming for about 3/8 inch deep. If not 1/2 inch. If your timber thickness will allow it, then 1/2 inch. And that'll enable plenty of space for the battery case to fit. So I've just swapped back to the 1/4" bow gouge, and I'm using that to remove this excess timber on the inside of the base. At this point, if you've got a square edge scraper, you can use it to scrape that bottom edge flat. I tend to just use the tip of the parting chisel, which does an adequate enough job for what we're doing. And we want to make sure that this too is dovetailed internally, again for the jaws of the chuck. And if you wish at this stage, you can always take your string of lights with the battery case and place your battery case in that recess. You want there to be room basically for you to be able to fit your finger in there and turn that on and off. And you want enough depth so that the battery case isn't sitting proud. So that could just be a little bit deeper. I'm going to just take a little bit more off, so it's more like 1/2 inch. But these battery cases are always mounted to one side because the wire will be coming out of a hole right in the centre. Now that's been made slightly deeper, we can do another dry run, and there's definitely going to be enough room there for the tape as well as the battery case. Next job is to actually sand and finish this bottom area because we won't get another opportunity. So I will mask up and come back to you once the sanding section has been done. The underside's now been sanded 180 grit and 240 grit. I'm now going to put an abrasive wax on there. I'm going to use some cut and polish, some chestnut cut and polish. And this will do a couple of things. It'll help to put down a base for the wax that we're putting on as a finish, and it will also finish the sanding process up to the equivalent of between 400 and 600 grit. So with any abrasive pastes, you put them on without the lathe spinning, and then we can turn the lathe on. So I'm just working the paste across the surface of the timber, and as it starts to create a shine, then that abrasive's done its job. I'm going to use a soft wax over the top. I'm going to stick with chestnut at the moment. I'm going to use some wood wax 22, and again I'll just put a coat of that on without the lathe spinning, and then buff that to a shine. So I'm opening the jaws up so it'll hold this on expansion, and the next job is to start to shape this piece. I'm going back to the 1/4 inch ball gouge again. I'm going to keep the shape very simple. I'm just going to go for a very simple flowing curve on the outside of this because the grain is so bold that we don't really want to interfere with the grain. We're going to let the grain do the talking, so a simple shape will help highlight that. So we'll get our speed back up to about 2,500. So I'm not watching the tool edge from where it's cutting here, I'm watching up here so I can see the shape developing. That way you can see, as you're turning, you can see the shapes that you're creating and make sure that your curves flow together properly. So we've got quite a nice curve on there. I'm going to bring the tool rest round to the front and start working on the top of this stand. Next thing we need to consider is begin to hollow this area out slightly and make it concave to fit the glass globe. Do not make this too wide, this section. The wider that you make it, the deeper that you've got to cut. So if you haven't got a very thick piece of timber, make the hollowing out area a little bit smaller in diameter. We've got quite a good chunk here, so we can take it a bit further out. Otherwise you'll end up turning out and meeting the recess at the bottom that we've cut for the battery case. So I'm sticking with a 1/4 inch ball gouge. And I'm just now double checking I'm happy with that curve before making sure that our glass globe will fit. The globe is going to go in so that the neck is facing down into the base. So we can't check that at the moment because there's no recess there for it, but we can check that it butts up around the other sections, which it does, but I just want to make this a little bit wider so it just sits a little bit lower with having the thickness of timber to enable us to do that. Give that another check, so that all butts up. I'm happy with that, that's a lot better. So now we can drill the hole for the lights. In order to drill the hole, we need to change our tailstock to a Jacob's chuck. So we'll insert the Jacob's chuck, and this has got a 4mm drill bit in it. Previously, I always used to use 4mm. However, depending on how thick the resin is that coats the LEDs on your string of fairy lights, you might need to go up a drill size. You will see when you open the fairy lights as to the thickness, and it's always worth checking. Sometimes you need to go up to 4.5, sometimes even 5mm. So initially, we need to retract the bit into the chuck as far as it will go to pilot the hole. We'll turn the speed down to about 800 RPM and then just begin to drill through the wood. And then we can extract the bit slightly more just to make sure that it drills all the way through. Next job is to cut the recess. So we're going to use a straight edge parting chisel. Turn our speed back up. So I've just gone in about 1/4 inch, and now we can start having a proper dry fit. Now that's not actually quite wide enough. I need to widen that slightly because we don't want a tight fit on this, because if the wood warps, it will put all the pressure onto the glass and it will crack your glass. It doesn't matter if there's quite a void between the wood and the glass, that will be filled with the adhesive that we're using, so there's no panic there. Go wider than you think you need, basically. And then I'm just going to use the edge of the parting chisel just to round that off slightly, and then we can have another dry fit. So now we need to take a little bit out of here because it's actually sitting proud on that. It's not quite butting up, so I need to take a little bit more out of there, maybe a tiny bit more depth. Back to the ball gouge. Just making it a tad deeper again with the parting chisel, and there we go. That's a fit that I am happy with. So we can now get this sanded up and finished. Same process as before: 180 grit, 240 grit, some cut and polish, and then some soft wax on top of that. This is now sanded up, so we can put our abrasive wax on there. I haven't put anything on this inner area because that's going to be used as a gluing surface. Can go back onto the soft wax and apply that over the top. So that's our base complete. We can put this to one side now. This is ready for assembly, and we can move on and turn our snowman's head and hat. Now we can just lift the tool rest up and get our beading parting tool to put our spigot on the end of the timber. So before we put this into the jars, we're going to swap now and put the ash in and do the same with our piece of ash. Back onto the roughing gouge to the ash. I prefer to do the snowman's head next because the hat can be then fitted to the head. First job is to face this front edge off. This is going to be the underside of the head of our snowman. So this needs to be made concave to fit the curvature of the glass. So we'll stop that and give that a dry run and see if it's got enough of a curve on there. So I've got my glass globe and I'm just holding it up to check that this wood butts up to the glass, which it doesn't. It's a little bit flat in the base still, so we need to make that a tad deeper. And that is what we're after. So the two of those now butt up properly. Can next shape the outside of the head, and we're just going for a sort of fairly spherical shape. Now this in no way has to be any kind of perfect sphere. We're just rounding him off. Make sure you watch the horizon of the piece of timber so you can make sure that that curve is flowing properly. And now we're getting to the stage that this chisel is now too chunky to fit in that gap, so we're going to swap to a 3/8 spindle gouge with a fingernail bevel on there, and that will enable us to really fit quite nicely into that gap. Just making some room for the chisel to fit, just widening that slightly so I can really roll the cut round and do as much work as possible on the lathe. So we just want to make sure that that is in proportion. I'm quite happy with that. I think those are some nice proportions there. It sits nicely. We're forgetting about that bottom bit. So for me, that can now be sanded and parted off. That's the sanding done. This is our layer of cut and polish. Again, try and avoid getting any cut and polish in this area because that's what we're gluing the head to the body of the snowman. And I'm working that across the surface till it buffs to a little bit of a shine, and then I'm going to part this off. I mentioned earlier I'm not going to put the soft wax on. The reason for that is because we're going to have a little bit of hand sanding to do, and we don't really want to be buffing all this section here to a really nice shine and then having to hand buff the top of it, because it's going to highlight the difference. So I part this off, give it a hand sand, and then finish the whole thing with the wax and hand buff the whole lot, and it just helps draw everything together. So I'm going to use my parting chisel in conjunction with my spindle gouge to part this off. So I start to take it down, bring the spindle gouge to start rounding it off and making sure that I'm blending that cut in as much as possible. And then the last bit I finish with the parting chisel. And just support that as you part it off, otherwise it will end up flying across the workshop somewhere. And that just leaves us with that little bit of tear out at the top and a few little turning rings, which we'll hand sand out fairly easily. So got a little bit of a mark at the top of the snowman's head here from parting off, but I'm not too worried about that because the majority of this is going to be covered by the snowman's hat. All I wanted to make sure is that this area is blended in. So we've sanded that to 240 grit now by hand. I'm going to put some cut and polish on there, give it a quick wipe over, and then I'm going to apply the wax. So of course, if you have a buffing wheel for the lathe, you could always buff these up using that just to get a little bit more of a shine. And it just pulls all that together. So that is Snowman's head finished so far. We obviously still have to put him some features on there, but we'll do that a little bit later on. So we'll change out the sycamore and put our ash into the chuck. We need to first of all make sure that this is trued up and start hollowing it out so it will fit the curve of Snowman's head. Now, the hat's going to be much smaller diameter, so I tend to start working on the outside shape of the hat before finally fitting this bottom edge. So I'm going to start work on here and begin to bring the hat to life. size wise with the hats, it is completely your choice. I like to make them quite large. I just think it gives it a little bit more character. And then once again, when we're running out of room with our ball gouge, I swap to the spindle gouge just to make these cuts just a little bit more defined. I like to turn the hat band on the hat, so I use the spindle gouge to achieve that, and the parting chisel just because I am not ambidextrous when it comes to turning. Before we now go any further, this is now the time we need to work on this edge and start to hollow it out more to fit the head, because at the moment it's very flat and doesn't sit particularly well. So we'll bring this back round the front, go back onto the ball gouge and start to hollow it. We need to stay away from this outer area here because that's quite fragile, but it's actually the middle here that we're wanting to just hollow out. So that is a much better fit. I don't want these two to butt up properly. I do want there to be a little bit of a gap, but that sits very nicely on the snowman's head. Next we can start the parting off process the same way we did the head, and we can sand this up. But we won't be putting any finish on just yet because I want to colour the hat, and this is where the fun bit starts. So I'm chamfering off the waist section and then just beginning the parting off process, and again I'm going to use the parting chisel, part through, and then go in with the spindle gouge to start to just create a bit more of a refined curve at the top of the hat, and this will help achieve that blended curve. We've got a 3/4 of an inch spigot holding the hat to the waist wood, if you like. So now is the time to get this sanded. Again, we've got a little bit of hand sanding to do off the lathe, but we'll sand this top section. So this has been sanded up to 320 grit. If you are going to be embellishing the grain at all, like we're going to be doing with this hat, you have to make sure there are no tool marks, no splits or cracks that you don't want on the piece of timber, and no sanding lines or tear out. Anything like that will show up with the embellishing wax. We're going to be using gilt cream today, and it really highlights it. I have not applied any finish. This is the bare timber, just sanded. The next step that we're going to take is this is a chestnut liming brush, it's a brass brush, and this we're going to use to scrub the grain clear of sanding dust. Now it's not going to mark the timber, don't panic about that, but it is going to clear out all that dust and open the grain of the wood, which is what we want because we want to fill it with the gilt cream. Be careful of this edge if it's particularly fine, not to apply too much pressure because we don't want to split it. I'm not bothered about this underside here because we're not putting anything there, just this top section here. And then we can finish parting this off. So back to the parting chisel, and I'm just going to use this chisel to part the remainder off. Again, I'm just supporting the wood very lightly so that it doesn't come flying off when we part through. So we'll probably be finished with a similar thing to the top of the head, so we've got that little bit of breakout where it's parted off and a little bit of area that just needs hand sanding. So we'll cut this off and sand that up. So I've sanded this top section up to a much higher standard than the snowman's head. The reason being that if we left it the same as the snowman's head, the embellishing wax would pick that out. So this is now sanded up the same as the rest of the hat, so we can now take the liming brush and clear out that grain, give it one final scrub over. Now we've got one more element to turn, which is optional, and that is the snowman's nose. I like to turn them. I obviously like to use either a piece of yew or a piece of purdue so that you can turn a little carrot nose. Before we do that, I'm going to spray this up so that it can be drying while we are turning the snowman's nose. So I have a little box here, which is what I do my spraying in, as you can see, and then it doesn't end up all over the place. And I'm going to put my snowman's hat in the middle, and I've got my chestnut ebonising lacquer, which I'm going to use to spray a coat over the top of this. So there's nothing else on this, it is just bare wood. It just helps the gilt cream stand out. It looks brilliant on a black background. So give it a good shake. The trick to putting your ebonising lacquer on, especially if you're filling the grain, is short, sharp bursts when you are spraying. You don't want to be stood with your finger on the trigger, absolutely layering loads of lacquer onto your piece of work. It's just not going to have the desired effect. And that is all we want to do, is short, sharp bursts. This is where your box comes in useful, because you can turn it round and make sure that you are getting the lacquer on each surface. So short, sharp bursts. If you start to see that it's building up a lot, just stop and just let it dry a little bit before putting another coat on, otherwise it's going to build up too much. So this now needs to dry, which is why I like to do it at this moment in time. Otherwise you're just waiting for things to dry before you can start the final finishing. So we can still see the grain, it's not oversprayed at all. That is exactly what we're after. Don't panic if it does layer up a little bit, let it dry, because the chances are it will soak into the grain still, but that is what we are looking for. So I'll put that out of the way, ready for the gilt cream application. So just change the jaws on the chuck to these smaller ones so that we can turn a little piece of yew. This is a yew pen blank offcut. Really great way of using these little bits of timber. And really all we need to do is just round this off, reduce it in diameter, and then put a little spigot on the back of it that we can then put into a locating hole in the head of the snowman. So a 1/4 inch bow gouge. Just working on reducing the diameter of this and just beginning to shape the nose. Swap into a spindle gouge just so I can get a little bit better of finish, and start to round the back of the nose off. Parting chisel to cut a little bit of a spigot on there. I'm going for about 3 to 4 mil. That's about a nice size for a locating spigot. And I always round the back of the nose off, because otherwise you'll end up with a flat against the rounded snowman head and it won't sit properly. We can now give that a quick sand. Little bit of polish on there. It's just using the residual polish that's left on that from earlier, and then we can finish parting the nose off. So back to the straight edge parting chisel. Just hold the nose as you part that off. That little pip at the bottom can just be nipped off with a knife or a carving chisel. So that's now being cleaned off, and that's ready to attach to our snowman. I suggest you do this fairly soon because these noses are very good at going missing. So next job is to drill a recess in our snowman's head to fit his nose, and for that I am going to use a little pin vise with a 4mm drill bit in it. I don't tend to use power tools to do this because it can end up skipping off the surface. I just tend to stick to this. Find the area that you want to be the front of his face. If you don't have a pin vise, I have used a Jacob's chuck with a drill bit in it before. It's slightly more bulky and a little bit more awkward to use, but it still has the same effect. And I've just put the drill bit into the Jacob's chuck and then held the Jacob's chuck in my hand to do the drilling. That is our recess. So we might as well start to assemble this. So I'll just grab a little bit of glue and just put a little bit of glue onto the spigot. Not much, don't want to go mad. So we've got our blob of glue on our snowman's nose. I'm holding the recess so it's pointing up. It just stops the super glue from running all over. And just push that in. Making sure you're happy with the way the grain's orientated on the nose. And that gives us our snowman's nose. So that can now be set aside just to dry, which won't take long. While the nose is gluing to the snowman's head, we can go back to our hat now, and we can actually start to embellishing it. The ebonising lacquer's dry, and it must be dry before you do this next stage, otherwise the pigment will stick to the wet lacquer and it won't give you the desired effect. I'm going to use the gold gilt cream, and I'm going to use fingers to apply this. Just get quite a decent amount onto your fingers, and then just begin to start rubbing it onto the snowman's hat. And you want to try and really push it into the grain, which is why I prefer to use fingers to do this job. Don't worry if there are any areas you can't quite reach, because they will be covered once you apply the soft wax over the top to actually remove the excess gilt cream, because at the moment we're just covering the hat with a decent layer, so it doesn't really look how we want it to look just yet, but you must make sure you've got plenty on so that it fills the grain. You really need clean fingers for doing this, otherwise you're just going to be pushing grease and grime into the grain as well as the gilt cream. Give that a few minutes. You then need a towel, or this is the best way I've found for removing it, and you need some soft wax in order to remove the excess. If you just try and rub it off with a towel, it won't remove it fully. Quite a nice coating on there of the wax, and then you can begin to wipe the excess off, and what will happen is you will see that all the gilt cream that's on the areas of hard grain will wipe off to show the ebonising lacquer underneath, and the rest of the grain is infilled with the gilt cream. This is where you'll start to fill all those awkward to miss areas as you're wiping it off, so it's not too problematic at all. And then when the majority of the excess has been removed, find a clean area on your towel and give it a nice buff. And there we have our finished effect, which really does highlight the grain. Final thing to do now is to assemble the whole piece. We've got all the individual parts made, so now we can start to put them together. For that you will need each of the components that we've turned, your large snowman kit, and you'll need some kind of glue. I use EvoStick Serious Glue. It's brilliant for fixing glass to wood. It dries clear, it dries flexible, and the bond is excellent. You don't want to use anything that sets solid, because any stress caused by the wood moving will pass through the glue and to the weakest point, which is the glass, and it will crack your glass. I like to use a pyrography machine to pyrograph the eyes onto my snowman. Again, that is up to you, that is personal choice. You could use a marker pen, you could glue googly eyes on. To glue the hat and the head together, I actually use a hot melt glue gun. It's excellent for gluing wood to wood. Not so much for wood to glass. I don't use it for that because it tends to let go of the glass, so that is why there is all this stuff on the table. I'm going to do my snowman's eyes first, while it's easy to hold the snowman's head. I'm using a ball tip on one of the razor tip pyrography machines for this, and it just gives me nice control for drawing the eyes on. So our snowman's eyes are done, and next I'm going to concentrate on putting the base together. So we need our components from the large snowman kit, and I'm going to begin by feeding the lights through the base. Now if you find that the 4mm hole is bunged up, which it possibly could be, just push through the 4mm bit just to clear any excess. So we'll unwrap the wires, unravel them, make sure that they are working. So we'll feed the lights through from the underside of the base to the top. Just pull those straight through. If you do find that any of them jam, try and avoid pulling them through. Push them through with some thick gauge wire. It'll just stop the wire from breaking. When you get to the section with the little tube round it, this has got a very weak solder joint in it, and they all are manufactured the same way. This is a battery case and it is soldered to the string of lights. This needs pushing into the 4mm recess, because otherwise when you're changing the batteries and you're moving the wire around, it's going to put a lot of strain onto that. So try and push that as far into that 4mm hole as possible. We can now stick our battery case to our base. If your battery case has screws in this middle area, remove them, because we're going to be covering these screw holes with the hook and eye tape. It doesn't need them because they're all snap shut cases. So we'll just put that on there, take off the backing of the other hook and eye tape, and then we can stick down the battery case. So I'm going to stick that to one side so that the on-off switch is easily accessible. Give that a push down, and then we can move the wire and just put that out of the way. So that is our battery case stuck in place. Next job is to feed the LEDs into the glass globe. So I'm just pushing those in and allowing the wire to find its way around the inside of the globe. They will naturally distribute themselves pretty evenly. And once they're pretty much all inside, we can then apply the adhesive. I am going to apply the adhesive to this area here. We don't want it going into the recess, otherwise we can end up gluing the lights in completely, and if we did need to change them for any reason, it makes it a lot more difficult. We want a nice generous bead of adhesive going all the way around this area, so that when we carefully just feed these last lights in and push the glass onto the base, it should form a really good bond. If you get a little bit of overspill, that's not a problem. We can cut that off later once it's dried. So that we can now leave to one side to set. Once it's set, we can then apply the glue to the underside of the snowman's head. Again, because it's glass to wood, we're using the same adhesive. So we've got a nice amount on there, and we need to just set that onto the globe at the top. And then you need to really get down to a level that you can turn the glass around and just make adjustments as needed to make sure that his head is as level as possible. Now is the time to also decide how you want the base to be orientated. So I want it set like this, so we want the snowman looking towards us in the direction that we want the grain to show. So I'm just turning him round, just making little adjustments until we're happy that his head is as level as we want it to be. This now needs to be allowed to set. It needs a good 15 minutes to half an hour before you start gluing his hat on. If you glue it on at this stage, it's going to pull the head over to one side. Snowman's had about a quarter of an hour drying time for the glue. We still need to allow this adhesive to dry overnight before we can actually cut it away with a knife, but it's set enough to allow us to glue his hat on. So I'm going to take my glue gun. We want to put a nice decent amount of hot melt glue on the inside of that hat, and then we can place it on our snowman's head. Don't worry too much about any overspill, because that can be rectified later on. We can just cut any overspill off with a knife. So that is our little snowman, all finished, apart from having the glue removed. So the snowman's had ample time to dry now, and that means that the excess glue around the neck area especially can now be removed with a Stanley knife blade. Please exercise caution when you are using it for more than one reason. First of all, you don't want to cut yourself. Secondly, you don't want to damage your finished piece of work, because this is often the time that you can end up rushing because it's all done. If you go in at an angle, you can end up pushing through the actual glass itself with the blade, so it needs to be more laid on the glass to do the cutting. And then just nice gentle cuts. Don't try and go straight through all in one cut. Just gently work your way around the glass and around the glue just to free it all the way. And the consistency that you're left with is quite a rubbery adhesive, which is why it acts as a cushion. Last bits of excess you can then cut away and actually scrape with the blade. And as long as you've got a nice clean Stanley knife blade in there, it shouldn't scratch your glass or mark it. We also need to just remove this tiny little bit of overspill from the hot melt glue gun. So again, just carefully cut that away with the knife. And then all that's left to do is to take a microfiber cloth and give the glass a final polish, just to get rid of any fingerprints or any stubborn little bits of adhesive that hasn't been removed with the knife. Just be careful when you are polishing that you don't put enormous amounts of pressure onto the glass. You don't want it shattering in your hands. And here is our finished snowman. Thank you very much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button. If you've enjoyed the video, give me a thumbs up and have a go and make one yourself. If you want to post a picture on my Facebook page of the projects that you've done yourself inspired by this, I will put a link to the Facebook page below. Happy turning. Bye. Can't remember what I was saying, therefore we'll start again. No. Me off now. Come on, Emma.